Gun violence has devastated families across the country. For many, it has meant the loss of a parent, a child, a student, a fellow officer, or a friend. And for their communities, it has meant persistent grief and lasting fear. That is why the Justice Department is bringing every available resource and every authority we have to the fight against gun violence. Every day, FBI, DEA, and ATF agents and Deputy U.S. Marshals put their lives on the line to combat gun violence and bring to justice those responsible for it. Recently, ATF found that the flood of illegal guns into our communities is increasingly driven by individuals who sell guns without a license and who do not conduct background checks. Too often, these black market guns wind up in the hands of people who are not allowed to have them. Too often, these black market guns are found at crime scenes. And too often, these black market guns are responsible for heartbreaking tragedies.
This is Michael Popok with the Legal AF Hot Take. We've got some great news, a historic development led by President Joe Biden to try to stem the tide of gun violence in America. We have a new regulation on the books which will expand the definition of who is a gun dealer and who is a gun seller to stop the sale of guns at gun shows and on the internet without requiring a background check. Now, some people might be scratching their heads like, we in America were allowing guns to be sold at gun shows and on the internet without requiring a background check? Yes, as depraved and disgusting as that sounds, that has been going on until the Biden administration finally, after almost 8 or 9 years, starting with the Obama administration, of trying to get this legislation passed and trying to get the change to the law passed, it's now a historic development. We have the change that we were looking for. Under this change, just so you get a little sense of context, 22% of all guns sold in America are done without a background check. 22%. Now, under this new regulation, which will require people that sell guns on the internet and people who sell guns at gun shows to be considered a dealer or engaged in the business of firearms sales to have to register. So they'll have to register. That's at least 23,000 people that were under the radar that the government did not know about, that they were in the business, whether it was a one-off deal or on a regular basis, of selling guns. Well, now they're going to have to register. In addition to that, anyone who buys from these people at gun shows, now all registered dealers, and on the internet, now all registered dealers, are going to have to go through a background check. Look, this is important. There's a reason that Joe Biden tapped Vice President Kamala Harris back in September to lead a blue ribbon group or a new agency devoted to trying to stem the tide of gun violence federally, and against much pushback by MAGA Congress, right, and Donald Trump. I mean, this law, this new regulation, let's just be clear, would never have been passed if the National Rifle Association, the NRA, wasn't weakened by Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, which has effectively put them out of business. If there was still a strong NRA supporting Donald Trump as president of the United States, this law does not get passed. This new regulation, historic in nature, does not get passed. There's no other way to say it. It's not a debate. It's a fact. It's 2024. It took Joe Biden 2 years into his own administration, even with his focus, to get this passed. Once again, the Biden administration delivering on a campaign promise. It's serious. We don't have to undersell this. Let's just call it for what it is. We don't blow smoke or sunshine. In almost every year, especially since the pandemic, 50,000 people in America die at the hand of a gun. 50,000 people die in this country, either through suicide or murder involving a gun. Okay? 54% of the people who died, of that 50,000, died at their own hand in suicide using a gun. 8 out of 10 murders in America are done using a gun. We have more than 600 mass shootings a year after year. Since COVID, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, it's 600 mass shootings, more than one person shot. I'm not talking about serial killing. I'm talking about somebody pulling out a weapon and shooting multiple other Americans at an event, a church, a school, a party, right? An event outside, a celebration, a bar, a disco, a ball game, you name it. 600 a year. Something has to be done. Since our United States Supreme Court has abdicated all responsibility to try to control gun violence, and instead, several years ago, with the MAGA right-wing Supreme Court in place, was able to strengthen the Second Amendment and find that it applies to a person's and gives the person the right to bear arms without really any regulation whatsoever, except if it existed back in the wild, wild West. If it didn't exist back in the wild, wild West, this Supreme Court doesn't want to hear about the attempts to regulate it. You know, in the Braun case, the United States Supreme Court case, they strengthened the Second Amendment. They uncoupled the language and found that the right to bear arms is not related to a well-regulated militia. It's just the right to bear arms. They just read out the rest of the sentence and the comma. And they say everybody can have it, right? Whether you're going to use it for militia or otherwise, you can have lots of weapons. And so there's always been this tension now created by the United States Supreme Court on this important constitutional issue on the right to bear arms versus the reality that in a country where people claim to have the right to bear arms in the Second Amendment, we've had 600 mass shootings, 50,000 people die a year using a gun. Numbers unheard of around the world. Now, at least one aspect of it is being addressed in a historic development. Now, 23,000 people who weren't currently registered with the federal government are going to be registered. 22% of gun sales that were without a background check to somebody will now have a background check. And who do you have to thank for that? Not MAGA Congress. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. This is how you line up your values, your politics, your law, all in one place at the voting booth. You vote for the party that gets you to the place you want to be in terms of your values. And if part of your value system, your personal value system, is to lower and regulate gun control or have gun control that regulates gun violence or lowers it, you've come to the right place. Biden administration, Democrats. I'm not just to be clear, I'm not anti self-defense weapons. I'm not. I mean, I don't want anybody to call me a hypocrite. But we're talking about background checks. We're talking about training. We're talking about maybe even psychological testing for people before they're allowed to carry a weapon. Shouldn't be a right. It should be a privilege, like driver's license. And your car can be an instrumentality of death. The gun was built to be that. Sure, there's hunters out there and sportsmen with guns and weapons. I understand. I'm talking about the people who take a gun into a church and kill everybody there, or in a supermarket in Buffalo, or a church in South Carolina. That's what I'm talking about. And anyone that's on the sidelines on this issue and thinks we don't need to regulate this is doing fine on its own, unregulated, is it? And how can you possibly say that? So at least now, the Biden administration has stood up for taking ghost guns off the street. Yes, 3D printers have gotten so sophisticated that you too can print a gun at home. And until the Biden administration came along, that gun was unregistered, right? As the police are trying to fight and take unregistered guns with no serial numbers, with serial numbers that are filed down by criminals, sold in the black market, trying to take them off the streets, the Trump administration and Republicans were allowing and in favor of ghost guns. Supreme Court continuing to consider issues like whether ghost guns have to be registered, whether you as a citizen are allowed to have a bump stock to convert effectively your semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon, for hunting people. That's the problem. And so I applaud and laud the Biden administration and Kamala Harris in particular, working with Joe Biden to get this new regulation on the books. Let me just read aloud to you the press statement made by Merrick Garland about what's been accomplished here. This is quoting the head of the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. Under this regulation, it will not matter if guns are sold on the internet, at a gun show, or at a brick and mortar store. If you sell guns predominantly to earn a profit, you must be licensed and you must conduct background checks. This regulation, the Attorney General continued, is a historic step in the Justice Department's fight against gun violence. That means Joe Biden's administration's fight against gun violence. It will save lives. As the ATF director, Stephen Dettelbach, said, there is a large and growing black market of guns being sold by people in the business of dealing and doing it without a license, and therefore they are not running background checks the way the law requires. And he continued, his own colloquialism, it's not safe for innocent, law-abiding Americans. In fact, it's doggone dangerous. I agree. That's an understatement, Director Dettelbach. And I think this is now going to help. This is now a part of the Safer Communities Act, which at the time said that all persons who devote time, attention, and labor to dealing in firearms as a regular course of trade or business to predominantly earn a profit would be considered a dealer. This regulation takes one step further and captures even more and further refines the definition of dealer, and then the requirements that people who buy from gun shows and on the internet also get background checks, a very good thing. Now, let's see if these regulations have an impact, positive, hopefully, in driving downward the statistics, the trends of, so we don't see 600 mass shootings a year. Can we at least get back to 2019 when it was only 400 mass shootings? That would be a start. Let's go there, firstly. But if anybody out there listening to my hot take thinks that if they vote for the other guy and put him in office, and maybe sweep in some sort of a Republican-controlled Congress, that this law is not going to come right off the books. It will. It will. He'll put some gun manufacturer in charge of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. It won't be Mr. Dettelbach. It'll be somebody you never heard of who contributed a lot of money to the Trump campaign that's in the firearm business. Why doesn't he put Wayne LaPierre, the former head of the NRA, in? I mean, he put, coal mine owners in charge of environmental protection agencies. All right, this is what he does. So if you think this isn't coming off the books, it is. If you think these things don't matter at the time of the election, they do. If you'd like to save your friends and family, loved ones, people around you from gun violence, or using a gun to commit suicide, or using it in a murder, then you support the administration that supports regulations like this. There's no other way to put it. I will continue to follow gun regulation laws, what the United States Supreme Court is doing about it, what this administration is doing about it, and what the other side has to say about it. One place, Legal AF on the MeidasTouch Network. Follow us on Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on this YouTube channel. You'll find out why we call it Legal AF. It's stories like this that I think help explain it. We sit at the intersection of law and politics so you don't have to. If you like this kind of content, this analysis by a lawyer who knows what he's talking about at the intersection of law and politics, then leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up. It signals to the gods of algorithm that you want to see more of this content. So until my next hot take, until my next Legal AF, this is Michael Popok reporting. Heary, heary, Legal AF Law Breakdown is now in session. Go beyond the headlines and get a deep dive into the important legal concepts you need to know, and we discuss every day on Legal AF. Exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, all for the price of a couple of cups of coffee. Join us at patreon.com/legalaf. That's patreon.com/legalaf.